See that we've let folks in the waiting room and that we've got a pretty stable number. So if it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for joining today, and thank Kelly Casey for the virtual shout out to Mr. Stern already. Today's event, Litigating the Flint Water Crisis. At the law school, our commitment is to providing a legal education to all of our students that allow you to graduate with the skills and experience necessary to make a difference in society and the world. We prepare you in and outside the classroom. We connect you with experts like our faculty and guest speakers, and hopefully we inspire you to become leaders in your community, much like Corey Stern has done. Corey is a partner with the law firm Levy Konigsberg, where he advocates for the environment and children's rights. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan switched its drinking water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint system as a cost-saving measure. Poor water treatment and testing resulted in major water quality and health issues for the city's residents, sometimes, for example, doubling or even tripling the lead levels in the blood of the city's children. In late 2016, Mr. Stern was appointed lead counsel for all of the plaintiff's claims in the City Court of Genesee County. Shortly thereafter, he was named the liaison counsel in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. And in August of this year, remarkably in the middle of a pandemic, Mr. Stern signed a settlement agreement with the state of Michigan for $600 million, in which he insisted that a majority of the money go to the state's most vulnerable children under the age of 6. It is the largest settlement by Michigan in its history. Today, you will hear from Corey about his path from the classrooms of our university to the courtrooms of America, where he led this watershed settlement. Today's discussion will be moderated by Callaway Chair Elizabeth Birch, an award-winning scholar whose groundbreaking work on multi-district litigation, mass torts, and class actions sets the standard for scholarship in this field throughout the country. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and we'll turn the program over to Professor Birch and Mr. Stern.
I just want to say very quickly before Corey gets started, I just want to chime in and thank him for being here. He's so generous, incredibly generous with his time. He came and talked to my torts class last year and to my mass torts class last year. And on all of my student evaluations, for some reason, they talked about Mr. Stern a lot more than they talked about me. So he was clearly the star of the show, and we're thrilled to have him back here with us today.
Thank you so much, Dean Rutledge and Professor Birch, for having me, and thank you so much, Kelly, for giving me the thumbs up. Kelly was Professor Casey was my moot court advisor, teacher over the last 20 years. She's been a very close friend of mine and somebody that I always run my biggest, dumbest ideas by, so she can either tell me that I should keep them inside my head or sometimes let them out. And Professor Birch has always sort of shared her classes with me in a way that makes me feel like the work that I'm doing is important, because she thinks that it's good for them to hear some of the stuff that I'm doing. So I appreciate the university for giving me the opportunity to talk to y'all. And I'll start out by saying that my 7 years in Athens, I was an undergrad at Georgia, and then I attended law school at Georgia, were some of the most important foundational years of my life. Not only did I learn about trying to become a lawyer, but I learned a lot about myself and, what my own strengths and weaknesses are. And, anybody who's in school between the ages of 18 and really any other point in time in life, whether you're a 23-year-old law student or a 43-year-old law student, you really have to dig deep and kind of recognize sometimes that everybody around you is smart and diligent and hardworking. And, it's not the easiest time in the world. And to do that and go through that in a place like Athens, where, every day when I woke up, no matter what I was feeling about myself or about life, I always felt a little bit better because I was in Athens, Georgia, as opposed to anywhere else. I hope all of you are able to appreciate on a daily basis, especially during a pandemic, just how beautiful it is there. The campus and the greenery and the architecture. to be able to spend your days in a place like that, especially when the days have some darkness to them, is a real blessing. So, I hope you all appreciate it. So anyway, Flint, I spoke with Professor Birch yesterday and sort of talked through some ideas I had about what to talk to y'all about. And I think that at some point during this discussion, it would be a great thing for you to ask questions, because the things that you can think about and the information that might be important to you may be different than what I think would be important to you. So I just wanted to start by at least telling you a little bit about the Flint litigation as a starting point. In 2012, the city of Flint was in really bad financial straits. They were on the verge of bankruptcy, and there's a funky law in Michigan that permits the governor of the state to appoint an emergency manager to take over financial control of a city, of any city, if that city doesn't seem to be functioning appropriately and is spending too much time in the red rather than the black. And during that same period of time, Flint was receiving its water, as it had for almost 50 years, from Detroit. Detroit's about 55 or 65 miles from Flint, and Lake Huron is a very good water source. And the city of Detroit would process the water from Lake Huron and send it to Flint, so that when it arrived in Flint, it was pre-treated and it was healthy and it was good water. But it was also really, really expensive water. And for $1 million a month, the city of Flint got its water from Detroit. And one of the first things that emergency management decided to do was to try to find a cheaper alternative water source in light of the cost of the water from Detroit, as well as the fact that the city really had no say-so in the rates. There had been this political back and forth between Detroit and Flint for many, many years, and people in Flint were very frustrated with having really no say in what their water was going to cost. There was this water source group called the Karagandhi Water Authority. It was a conglomerate that was coming together around this time. It had not yet built its pipeline, but it planned on servicing various communities in Michigan and potentially could service Flint. Flint made a decision through its emergency manager in 2013 to switch to the Karagandhi water source. It's commonly referred to as the KWA. And Detroit, upon finding out that Flint was making the switch, Detroit terminated its contract with Flint and gave it 1 year until it was going to have to find a different water source. So Flint was switching to the KWA. The KWA wasn't yet built. Detroit was mad that Flint was switching, so they cut off Flint, gave him a year to continue, but then said, find your own water. And the KWA, it turns out, wasn't going to be ready for 3 or 4 years. So Flint, after 1 year, was going to have to find its own water because the KWA wasn't going to be ready and it could no longer stay with Detroit. And it chose to utilize or attempt to utilize the Flint River, which was a surface water that needed to be seriously treated in order to be properly utilized by communities for drinking water or for bathing water or for any end use. And Flint made the decision to utilize the Flint River and never upgraded its water treatment system, never treated the water ultimately. And when bad water flows through lead pipes or copper pipes, as every city, old city in this country has, untreated water is going to leach all of the bad stuff from the pipes to the water. And then when it gets to the end user, people are going to be drinking water that is, filled with lead or copper. So that's sort of the background story of how Flint got bad water. And there's some salacious facts embedded in all of that, and banks that, gave bonds to the city for $80 million, despite the fact that the city was in really bad financial position. But ultimately, that's the story. And as the media has reported for 5 years since then, 100,000 residents of Flint potentially were affected by the water, the most vulnerable of which were children, because children who are 6 years old or younger are really susceptible to brain damage from exposure to lead, and the water that they drank or the water that they were fed with formula as infants, or the water that their moms drank when they were in utero was infected with lead. So that's the backstory. And then you get to the litigation. And so my story, because I don't know how many of you actually care about my story, but in terms of what your story could look like as a UGA grad or someone who, I was sitting in your seat 18 years ago and not having a clue, what was I going to do? How was I going to do it? What did I want to be? Did I want to be a lawyer? What type of lawyer? How do you get from that point to 18 years later doing a webinar with a group of law students and faculty at your university where you graduated from? I started out by wanting to do plaintiffs litigation. I knew my mom was an insurance adjuster for Allstate when I was growing up, and my stepdad was a detective. And I think to spite them, I wanted to sue people and invoke insurance coverage in every case that I possibly could, so that my mom and her company could suffer a little bit or something. But I always had this hankering to do plaintiffs work. I clerked over each summer at various defense firms. I never had an opportunity to work at a plaintiff's firm. Was extremely overpaid in each of my clerkships, considering I really didn't know anything. And as many of you probably know, at least back then, and I assume now, it's an opportunity to get to know future employers and for them to wine and dine you and then ultimately hire you. And as I got closer to graduating from law school, I really didn't have an interest in working for any of those firms, but I had no opportunities to work for plaintiff firms. And Professor Casey convinced me for a year to go work for Judge Lark Ingram in Cobb County Superior Court. There was a plaintiff's firm that I really wanted to work for called Pope McGlamory in Atlanta, but they had never hired someone as young or dumb as I was. And Kelly convinced me that if I worked for Judge Ingram for a year, that perhaps that opportunity would come to light, because I'd have some experience working with a Superior Court judge, and most of their cases are in Superior Court in Georgia. And I agreed to go work for the judge. And during that entire year where I was clerking for the judge, I was practically begging on a weekly basis each of the, at the time, 13 lawyers at Pope McGlamory to meet me or have lunch with me or just hang out with me. And ultimately they gave me the opportunity to come interview with them. I interviewed at their office in Columbus with each lawyer and their office in Atlanta with each lawyer. And Judge Ingram, I was probably ready to get rid of me. And so she put in a good word for me with them, and they ultimately hired me. I have no idea what they paid me at the time. I was just excited to go work for a plaintiff's firm. And for 4 or 5 years, I had the opportunity to work at Pope McGlamory on class action cases and mass tort cases, and really important cases for all of their clients. And how I was able to do that was by taking a little bit of a path that I had not anticipated, going to work for a Superior Court judge. Why I tell you that is I imagine that for some of you, and this is just the beginning of my story, but for some of you who may have a desire to do something that's a little bit different than what seems to be available to you as a second or third year law student considering your future, I took this little detour that wasn't super popular. It wasn't a federal clerkship, so it didn't come with the same, level of prestige as some other clerkships did. But I just knew inherently that working at the defense firms that I had clerked for me, was not something that I was going to enjoy. It was not something that I foresaw as my life's path or my professional path. And for whatever reason, I was unwilling to do it even for a short period of time, despite the money that was being offered to students at that time. And so I just took this alternate route and trusted in my gut and trusted in Kelly's gut and trusted that when I met Judge Ingram, that she knew what it was I ultimately wanted to do. And that if I worked really hard for her, she would help put me in that space as well. And I really trusted in myself. I trusted that if I wanted it bad enough and if I worked really hard, that ultimately somebody would give me a shot to do the type of work that I wanted to do. 4 or 5 years into my time with Pope McGlamory, I realized that these other lawyers that I was working with, all of whom were partners, I was the only associate, they were really smart and fantastic lawyers. And I wanted to be a trial lawyer. I read To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in high school, and I wanted to be Atticus Finch. And I was never going to have, or at least in my own mind, I was not going to have that opportunity at that firm for a really long time, because all of the lawyers that I was working for, they all loved doing that as well. And they were a lot better at it than I would have been, because I had never really done it before. And so again, I trusted in Kelly and kind of trusted in myself that there was something else out there for me. And Natalie Woodward, who's a law school graduate, who some of you may have met or known or interviewed with, she and I decided to leave our high-paying firms and all of the great work that we were doing to start our own firm during a financial crisis in 2007 for no good reason. And we opened up a shop in Roswell, Georgia. And for 8 years, we started out by litigating smaller personal injury cases, and every now and then took on felony criminal cases. And Natalie did a decent amount of domestic work. And on a weekly basis, we were in court trying cases, arguing motions, writing our own briefs. Our secretary initially was Natalie's mom. She kind of ran the firm and ran my life. We ultimately hired Michelle Izquierdo, who some of you may know as Michelle King, who's also a law school graduate, and she became our first associate. And for 7 or 8 years, Natalie and I just litigated the types of cases that were available to us and that we wanted to do. And it was all plaintiff's work. And I never would have had an opportunity to first chair a large plaintiff's trial if I had not taken that veered road off the path to Judge Ingram, and then trusted in myself enough to work for Pope McGlamory, and then was dumb enough, but also confident enough to go do my own thing for a little while. And then you fast forward to 2014. I grew up in a small town in New York where my parents still lived at the time, and my dad was very sick. And I have at the time a 5-year-old and 6-year-old, 2 sons, and was married. And Natalie and I were doing pretty well. I had built my dream house with my wife, and in an instant had this kind of inkling that I needed to go to New York and bring my family to New York and spend some more time with my dad, because he was sick and I wanted my kids to know him. And I had done a little bit of work with this firm called Levy Konigsberg, which Dean Rutledge alluded to at the very beginning. The same way I begged Pope McGlamory for a job, I found myself, 12, 13 years later, having served as a partner in a firm that I started successfully, kind of begging for a job at this firm as well, because they did the same type of work that I had previously done at Pope McGlamory. They did the same type of work that Natalie and I were always either doing or trying to do. And my compass in all of that was kind of the work. I think back now, between 2003, when I graduated law school, and 2014, when I moved to New York, the one commonality I had, despite girlfriends and then a wife and kids and firms and houses and apartments, I always knew that I just wanted to represent people who were hurt bad. And in particular, I always loved representing children. When I got to Levy Konigsberg and refused to take no for an answer and took a dramatic pay cut and moved my family to a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, there was a partner at the firm who was about to retire who handled lead poisoning cases for children in the inner city who were brain damaged from exposure to lead paint in public housing for the most part. And I think that the people who became my law partners at Levy Konigsberg saw that I was kind of fearless when it came to litigating. I also had this southernness to me, which made me not very intimidating or in your face. And this gentleman who had been their partner for 30 years was about to retire. And I think they saw that there was a potential for me to take over that part of the practice. And I began litigating lead paint cases as though I had done it my entire career. I acted like I had done it my entire career. And there were some similarities to those cases, to other cases that I had handled. People were hurt, people were exposed to bad things, and it mostly affected children. And in 2015, when news started breaking about Flint, Michigan, my legal secretary and my wife almost at the same time said to me, why are you not considering doing work in Flint, considering all of the lead poisoning cases that you've been handling for the last 2 years? And almost the same day, I got a phone call from a woman in Detroit, Michigan, who told me that she had moved there from Flint, that she and her children were exposed to lead in the water at a homeless shelter that they were living in Flint. I really didn't know much about the crisis or the situation. I wasn't licensed to practice in Michigan. I was barely licensed to practice in New York. I had only known that kids were exposed to lead from paint, and the water bend seemed a little bit out there to me. I told her originally I couldn't help her. After being beaten up by my wife and legal secretary about it, I called her back. I did some research and I kind of begged her to let me represent her. And she laughed at me and reminded me that I wasn't licensed to practice there. I told her I would get licensed, and she became, with her children, my first Flint client. And like the bulldog, not necessarily the Georgia bulldog, but like, trying to be kind of ferocious. I guess bulldogs aren't the most ferocious dogs. Maybe the pit bull that I kind of channeled in some of my litigations. Rachel Maddow was putting on a town hall in Flint, Michigan on an evening during the week, during the winter of 2016. I think it was in January. And I went to my law partners and I was like, I'm going there and I'm going to just, get as much information as I can. I showed up I flew there on a whim. I think I called my wife from the office and said, I'm flying to Flint. We have a picture in my house from the day that I flew there. She thought I was just nuts to get on an airplane and go to Flint without an invitation to this town hall meeting with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. And I flew there. I was in a suit, I think. And when I got to this gymnasium, they would not let me in because it was clear that I was an attorney who was trying to either get clients or, people don't like attorneys that much, especially in a situation at a town hall in a gymnasium on MSNBC. I went back out to my car. I quickly changed. I put on a hoodie and a baseball cap, which Kelly and probably Professor Birch can attest is how I'm more normally seen most of the time. And they let me right in. I looked like, a townie and somebody who was there for all the right reasons. I heard at this town hall, people explain to these parents that their kids were going to be fine. There was really nothing wrong. If they just ate a ton of leafy green vegetables and we all got more school nurses, that all these kids were going to be okay. And I was mortified because in the 2 or 3 years that I had been handling lead poisoning cases, I knew that the information that these parents were getting was completely erroneous. It was on the verge of lies. So I flew back to New York the next morning, ironically sitting next to Rachel Maddow on the airplane. And I went to my partners and I said, we need to go there and just represent kids. If we don't, then I'm a fraud. How do I do all this lead poisoning work? And this is the biggest lead poisoning crisis I think that our country will have ever seen. And when this thing's over, people are going to be amazed at how many children were affected by this. And for whatever reason, they trusted me and they said, just go do it. And so every week from the first week of February until November, December of 2016, I would fly to Flint on a Sunday night and I would come home on a Thursday night. I would stay at a hotel in Flint. I would speak at churches, speak at schools. I opened a very small office in Flint and people would come in, and it went from those 3 folks or 4 folks that I represented who called the woman from the homeless shelter to 20 clients, to 70 clients, to 100 clients. And now sitting here today, we represent about 3,000 children and their parents individually, not as a class action, but individually as part of the crisis, as part of the litigation. We have filed an individual claim for every single one of them. Some of them are filed in the Genesee County State Court. Some of them are filed in the Eastern District of Michigan. There are cases filed in the Court of Claims, which for some of you who may have taken various types of civil procedure or, maybe even Georgia practice, probably not Georgia practice, but some states have courts of claims that deal with cases against governmental entities. And the group of defendants grew from the state of Michigan to private entities to the Environmental Protection Agency to, as of 2 weeks ago, I filed the first lawsuit against JP Morgan Chase, and Wells Fargo for their role in the bonding part of this litigation. And not only was my personal road to get to Flint extremely winding, but the road of the litigation is extremely winding because you're dealing with a federal judge, a state court judge, courts of claims judges. In Michigan, governmental entities, if they lose on motions, even if they're not dispositive motions, have an automatic right to an appeal. And so intertwined in all of the litigation has been moments or months or weeks of waiting while courts of appeals are reviewing the district court's rulings to determine things like immunity. And so the litigation has gone on since the first cases were filed in November of 2015. My first cases were filed in February or March of 2016. And here we are in almost November of 2020. And, you know, President Obama was in charge at the beginning of the litigation, and during the entire crisis. President Trump has been in charge for the last 4 years, and this litigation will continue to a new administration, or I guess to the same administration for another 4 years, depending on the results of the election. But it's crazy that we've now been through what will be a third cycle of an executive in this country. Governor Rick Snyder was a Republican in Michigan who was sued in all of my cases and in many of the other cases. He is no longer the governor. And now many of you know who Gretchen Whitmer is, either from the more recent news about, you know, the potential coup to take her as a hostage, all the way back to, you know, a very contentious election against who the attorney general was for the state of Michigan, who ran for governor and who was prosecuting some of these cases criminally. And so the litigation has been as much of a maze and a puzzle just between various venues as the substantive components of the litigation has been. And when you have cases in 3 different courts at the same time, all involving the same subject matter, as well as on appeal involving the same subject matter, it takes a significant amount of patience and organization and just really craziness to manage and to kind of hold your arms around all of it. And then you might be asking yourself, well, how does this kid who didn't want to go work for a defense firm and went and worked for a superior court judge and then opened his own firm and then showed up in New York and became a lead poisoning lawyer and then on a whim flew to Rachel Maddow, how do you become lead counsel or liaison counsel in a large mass tort litigation? Judges, I mean, the real answer is judges need to get very drunk and they need to just pull names out of a hat. That's not the real reason. But, you know, the real way that it happens is, you know, my wife asks me all the time, my kids have asked me, like, how did you get to do this? And I think the one thing that I've done consistently through the first day I ever met the circuit court judge through today, and, you know, I'll have a hearing with the federal court judge tomorrow at 2:00 in the afternoon, and it'll go through then, and it'll go hopefully through my entire career. I have been to a fault fundamentally honest and candid with every judge that I've ever encountered in my life, almost to a fault, but certainly consistently. And I think I learned that working for a superior court judge, and her biggest beef at all times was when people were disingenuous or when they appeared disingenuous or when they didn't know how to say, I don't know. And so we all started showing up in these courthouses with these judges, and we'd be asked like very serious questions, such as, how many clients do you think ultimately lawyers will have in this case? And what do you really believe the litigation is going to entail? And how long do you think it's going to last? Do you see this as a class case, or do you see it as an individual case, or some molding of the two? And I always was willing to say, I have no idea. I was always willing to say, I'm wrong. I was always willing to say, I can find out, but right now, I just don't know. And when folks started applying for lead counsel or leadership positions, I went back to my partners and said, I don't think we should do this. I don't know how to do this. I've never done this. You know, the judge is not going to pick me. And they were fine with it. We decided as a team that that was not something we were going to pursue. We were just going to litigate our cases. And one of the defense lawyers in Flint, in their papers, in response to either a motion for leadership or as an initiating motion having to do with leadership on the defense side, dropped in a footnote a very kind comment about me, about how unfortunate it was that I didn't apply, or that the court should seriously consider some folks outside of the applicants, including, me. And when on November 16th, 2016, an order came out from the circuit court judge appointing leadership, my name was in there as lead counsel for all the plaintiffs. And I almost had a heart attack. I mean, I didn't really know what it meant. I thought maybe it was a mistake. But a judge who I had spent at that point probably a year with, or 7 or 8 months with, every week, dealing with cases that had been filed and trying to manage the litigation. He was a small town judge in Flint, Michigan, and there were a lot of big time lawyers who were flying in from all over the country. And either because of, my subtle twang, or the fact that I was always honest, or that I looked a lot younger than some of the others and was probably a bit, green, and appeared to be someone who was always being truthful with him, I think he felt that in the scope and with the tenor of the litigation as it was becoming, that I was someone that he could trust. And, so lesson number 2 in my journey is, 1, just kind of try and find what it is the thing is that you really want to do, and just, fight for it. And 2, just be honest and authentic. It very well could have been a different judge under the same circumstances who would have thought that I was just completely outrageous for always being honest. That in his experience as a judge, lawyers weren't supposed to be as honest. Lawyers were supposed to hold their cards closer to the chest. And perhaps I just got very lucky with a judge who valued the things that made me a decent person and a pretty good lawyer, whereas another judge could have come to a completely different decision. And then a few months later, when the federal judge was making determinations about leadership in federal court, and she had had significantly more experience dealing with mass torts and potentially MDLs, this wasn't an MDL, but it's like an MDL. She, I think, spoke with the judge in Genesee County to find out, what I was about. And she also appointed me to essentially the same position for individuals. And, I don't think there's some roadmap where I could give you 3 pages and say, if you check every one of these boxes over the course of your career, you'll ultimately be appointed as lead counsel in a large litigation somewhere in this country. But I can tell you that if you're extremely passionate about the work that you're doing, and you are super genuine and completely authentic with the court and respectful, to the courts and the judges that you're dealing with, you're giving yourself a far better chance than most other lawyers. Because the lawyers that I've encountered, sadly, in Flint and in other aspects of my career, they're not always as forthright. They're not always as authentic, and they're not always as passionate about the work that they're doing as I think they ought to be, certainly as I hope I am. And it's kind of made all of the difference in my career. I don't want to take too much more time before questions, but one of the other things that I think is important to talk about is the settlement itself, to the extent I can talk about it, because that's probably the reason we're here today talking as a group rather than maybe to an individual class. Is in August of this year, news broke. By the way, crazy story about how it broke. The settlement was supposed to be announced on a Friday. And we had signed a settlement agreement maybe a week earlier, and we're trying to get all of our ducks in a row as a group. The state of Michigan, the class action lawyers, the individual lawyers. We had an embargo on talking to the press. Nobody was supposed to do anything. It was all going to happen at the same time. It was the week that that may have been a Freudian slip. It was the week that the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, was selecting his vice presidential running mate. And I think most people know now he chose Kamala Harris, but at the time it was narrowed down to really 2 individuals. And those 2 individuals were Kamala Harris and Gretchen Whitmer from the state of Michigan. There were others involved, but nobody wanted an announcement to be made until Democratic nominee Biden, former vice president, had made his decision, because Gretchen Whitmer was either going to accept his invitation to be vice president or have large role at the Democratic National Convention, and they didn't want the Flint announcement to in any way either make it more difficult for her to get selected or make her message different than it would have otherwise been, or just influence the convention in a way that wasn't expected. So the convention was scheduled to end on a Thursday. The announcement was going to be made on a Wednesday. And on a Tuesday night at like 7 o'clock, I started getting calls from various media folks who had the story. They knew it, they had it, and it was going to break. And my biggest fear was I had 3,000 clients who we were prepared to send mass emails and texts to announce the settlement the minute before Governor Whitmer was going to announce it that Friday. And they were already publishing stories at 10 o'clock at night on the New York Times website, on the Washington Post website. We weren't allowed to give comments yet. It went crazy. And my team from my firm, including me, who lead counsel in Flint, partner in the firm, big shot, I'm not. We stayed up from 10 p.m. till 5:30 in the morning, texting and emailing whatever way we could, all of our clients, sometimes from our personal phones, sometimes from emails we had set up, trying to use programs that our firm had, so that the next morning when they all woke up and saw the headline in the news that there was a settlement, when they looked at their phones, they would have at least had some communication from us telling them that there was a settlement and that we wanted them to hear it from us before they heard it from anywhere else. The settlement is a proposed settlement, which means that it hasn't yet been approved by the federal judge, although I think it will be approved. It is only between, as of now, the plaintiffs, claimants, anybody who was potentially injured in Flint, and the state of Michigan. So it does not include the Environmental Protection Agency. Obviously, it doesn't include JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo. They were just sued. It doesn't yet include the city of Flint. It doesn't include any of the private contractors who were sued and played significant roles, from my perspective, in the creation of and the perpetuation of the Flint water crisis. And those folks will either come into the settlement at some point in the next few weeks, or they won't. And there will be bellwether trials, which are scheduled for June 1st, 2021, for 4 children who were all under the age of 6 at the time of the crisis. And those cases will be tried in Ann Arbor, Michigan, before Judge Judith Levy in the Eastern District for the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. And all 4 of those bellwether individuals are my clients. They're 4 of the kids that I represent. So we'll play a very active role, obviously, in that trial. And that's sort of where we are in Flint. I've sort of told you how I was born into being a lawyer, how I chose my path, or how the path chose me, how I got lucky enough to serve in my capacity as lead or liaison counsel in Flint. My role in the settlement, just so you know, was I was a pain in the neck. There was a 2-week period where the mediators told me I was no longer allowed to participate, that it was just too disruptive. And I'm not a disruptor. I'm not like a bomb thrower. I mean, I'm relatively chill. Most people are more surprised when I tell them what I do for a living than they are expecting it. But I was insistent the entire time that if there was going to be a settlement and it was going to include a class action that I did not believe in this litigation, that the majority of the money had to go to kids and that none of the kids could be a part of a class. Because I didn't think that it would be possible, to bind children to a class, because who makes that decision? Their parents. Okay, what happens when they turn 18 and they got $25 from some class action settlement and they come to court and say, well, this wasn't fair. I didn't make a decision about this. I can't even read paragraph 3 without forgetting paragraph 1 and 2 because I was severely lead poisoned and I didn't choose to be a part of this and I didn't have an opportunity to not be a part of this. So that was never going to work. And I also felt like every kid that's injured from lead poisoning is injured very, very differently. And you should not be treating kids uniformly as a class just because it's expedient or because it may be more cost effective. Each kid should have been treated on their own based on the injuries each sustained and how those injuries would manifest themselves over the lifetime of that child. So I'm really proud that in the settlement, 80% of the money, 80% of the $600 million is going to children who were under the age of 18 at the time of the crisis. And 65% of all the money is going to kids who were age 6 or under during the crisis. And none of those kids are part of a class action. Every one of them will have to make their own individual claim, whether they have a lawyer or they don't have a lawyer. They do not have to have a lawyer. That's another thing that I didn't know how there were some people who insisted that every kid needed to have a lawyer. I mean, that's not America. You know, I could go to court right now and file a lawsuit if I didn't have a law degree on my own behalf against the president of the United States. It may get thrown out in 7 minutes, especially with, the current politics of the world and the way the judiciary is sort of, trending. But I have every right as an individual who's not a lawyer to file a lawsuit against whoever I want without needing a lawyer. And so I'm really proud of the proposed settlement. Hopefully the judge will get a motion to approve it in the next couple of weeks, and she'll approve it or preliminarily approve it by the end of the year. And then children and people can start making claims, and we'll see how it all shakes out. So that's my journey. I told you how I felt about Athens, tell you how I felt about the law, tell you how I felt about Flint. And at this point, if y'all have any questions, I know that was a lot of rambling. I feel like the guy from The Martian, just like looking into a computer and just telling stories because nobody else is talking back. So I'm open to any questions that y'all may have at this point.
Well, thank you, Corey. Thanks for doing that. It looks like Professor Shipley would like to ask a question, so I'm going to unmute him there for a second.
I already know what he's going to ask. He's going to ask, why did I not give him the same level of props and respect that I gave Dean Rutledge, Professor Birch, and Kelly, since he was always Obi-Wan Kenobi to my Luke Skywalker, and I didn't realize he was on the call, or he probably would have been the only person that I would have mentioned at the begining.
Well, hey, Corey, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes, sir.
I was gonna I wrote a couple notes down, and I wish we could bottle and sell your personal skills. And we've known each other since, I'm gonna say, you were an undergrad. I remember you talking to me about coming to law school. And I've watched you interact with judges when you were here, with the Inn of Court, with our moot court program. You really have a remarkable talent on top of hard work and a lot of smarts. And so I'm really sort of a shout out to you, saying I'm not surprised where you are. You really have a lot going for you. And I did in the chat, I wrote down 2 questions. Didn't you know some Pope McGlamory lawyers from being a pupil in the Lumpkin Inn? And wasn't Natalie just a year ahead of you in law school? You made a lot of connections when you were here that have paid off, I think.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So Bill Norwood was one of the partners at Pope McGlamory when I was in law school. And through Inns of Court, that's how I learned about Pope McGlamory in the first place. The way he talked about the firm to me during one of our dinners somewhere in Atlanta, it was this collaborative firm where all the lawyers worked on cases together, and they were always representing the right people, and they were always fighting the good fight. I was like, I want to do that. And he was essentially like, no, I wasn't telling you to get you to come work with us. I was just bragging on my firm. We don't hire people out of law school. But without that connection, I never would have been. I mean, that's a great question, because I just said all this stuff, but how was it that I decided I wanted to do this kind of work? Yeah, I did read To Kill a Mockingbird, but, I also read other books as a kid, and I didn't want to, I didn't want to do other things simply from having read a book. So despite being inspired by To Kill a Mockingbird, it took a number of other influences on me over the course of my life to decide what I wanted to do. And the Lumpkin Inn of Court was really one of those things, because I met all these lawyers and judges. And even when Kelly recommended to me, and I guess to Judge Ingram, that I get to go work there, I'm reminded by this conversation that Judge Ingram was in the Lumpkin Inn of Court, and she knew who I was. So it wasn't like Kelly necessarily had to sell me to her. She already knew who I was because we had met at some of those functions. So some of the activities and listen, as someone who graduated from college and then went to law school at Georgia, both, from Athens to Athens, there were other things I wanted to do than go to Atlanta on a Wednesday night to sit with a bunch of judges and lawyers. I mean, I had plenty to do in Athens, and I was very excited to be there with many of my friends who also stayed for law school. And it was just kind of a continuation on some level of our undergraduate years. But I was convinced by people like Dean Shipley and Kelly to branch out from my safe space and from the things that I wanted to do because they were fun, to try and do things that could actually either inspire me or ultimately help me professionally. And so, yes, that was a big part of my experience at Georgia. And Natalie was a year ahead of me at UGA. She's also a double dog. We knew each other somewhat in college, and she was on moot court as I was on moot court, but she was a year ahead of me. And Kelly, she was played a matchmaker. I think Natalie had probably reached out to Kelly, as so many of Kelly's former students do, saying, I'm not really happy with what I'm doing. I want to do more. We probably called her during the same week, giving her the same story, despite the fact that we weren't super tight. And Kelly played matchmaker and said, y'all need to get together and talk about this together. At the same time, some of you may know Jeff Shiver and Alan Hamilton. Those were classmates of ours, and Shiver and Hamilton have a great law firm now throughout the state of Georgia. Jeff Shiver was my roommate for 3 years in college and in law school, and is one of my best friends. And we were all talking around that same time about, our course and our paths and what did we want to do and the types of lawyers we wanted to be. And those are conversations that all of you will have at various times in your careers. And sometimes you'll have it over 2 bottles of wine and then wake up the next morning and say to yourself, that was dumb. I know what I was thinking. But there are going to be some moments where you have an opportunity to actually make that leap or take that risk or, sober up a little bit and say, that really was a good idea. And all I can tell you is that those moments, those decisions, as scary as they are, both from a financial standpoint, as well as from here I am making $100,000 a year as a 23-year-old kid at some big firm. I'm on a path to make $1 million when I'm 40 if I just stick with it, despite the fact that I'm not super happy. Those are hard decisions to make when you've never made more than $15 an hour working at a coffee shop somewhere or at a summer camp, but if deep inside you, somewhere in your core, that's your path, I can only say, don't be scared to do it, because I wonder where I'd be if I had stayed at Pope McGlamry. I think I would have been an exceptional lawyer, and I still remain really close with them. Jay Hirsch, who's a partner at Pope McGlamry, he was one of the folks in my wedding party when I got married, and he's 20 years older than me. His son just moved to Brooklyn, New York, and he and I were in touch during COVID when they were moving 20 miles away from where I live. I mean, it's not about taking risks and burning everything that's behind you and on the side of you to get to where you're wanting to go. You want to also maintain those relationships, but do not be scared to fail. Do not be scared to make tough decisions, because if you fail, you'll always still have a law degree from the University of Georgia. And there's always going to be somebody that's willing to hire you to, at a minimum, do the thing you didn't like doing in the first place. You can always go back. But what you can't do is have an opportunity that you think in your core is something that you really want to do and ought to do, but you're too scared. If you don't take those chances, you may not get other opportunities to take them.
Great. Well, I know I have a few questions from my folks in Mass Torts that they've sent me already, and we're of course happy to take questions. If y'all want to just raise your hands, we can do that. We've got about 10 minutes left or so. So, one of the questions that I got was about futures claimants. So we've talked a little bit in Mass Torts about what do you do with the futures problem? I mean, a number of these kids, as you mentioned, are going to grow up. What's going to happen is the class action covering kind of a bigger group, or is it just the individuals that you're representing? If you could maybe talk a little bit about how that works.
So there is not going to be any futures group as part of a class action, because the only futures group is going to be for children. And there is a set aside from the settlement that's going to be put into escrow or trust for potential claimants who come forward after the settlement. There is also provisions that'll come out once the actual settlement document is released, that still permits children to file lawsuits. And so no one will be prohibited from continuing to litigate their cases if they choose to file after the settlement. And there's a significant amount of the settlement that is going to be set aside, knowing that there will be children who miss the opportunity. And the best part of that for me is, if people don't claim that money, if those claims aren't filed down the road, and then everybody's sort of time to file expires by statute of limitations, all of that money will revert back to children at a pro rata share. And so there is no opportunity for adults in this litigation, not because they weren't necessarily hurt or because they didn't feel as though they were really put out by the crisis, either from having to use bottled water for a number of years or for developing a skin rash or, in some instances worse. I'm not undermining what those folks went through, but ultimately the majority of the injuries and the people who really will suffer generationally are going to be the kids. And so as part of the settlement, any money that doesn't go to the futures is going to revert back to all the kids in a pro rata form. And in fact, I'll probably get in trouble for saying, I don't know if I'm supposed to, but if the money goes unclaimed by adults, one of the reasons I finally signed on to it, all of that money will revert to the children as well. And so if you've got 20% of $600 million going to adults and only 17 of them show up, which isn't going to happen, a lot of them will show up. But if it doesn't go fully claimed, then that money as well will revert to the children.
Great. If other folks would like to raise hands, you're welcome to do so. I see there's a question in our chat box asking about how long the average lead paint case lasts, and then how long does the average Flint case last?
So one of the difficulties about lead poisoning cases is kids are generally diagnosed with lead poisoning when they're very young because they go get physicals before first grade and second grade and third grade or whatever their annual, physical is, especially in cities where it's prevalent, lead poisoning is prevalent. But oftentimes the injuries don't really manifest themselves until later in life. And so if I have a 3-year-old kid that was lead poisoned, you can't even really test cognitively a 3-year-old for injuries until that 3-year-old is 6 or 7, or really the older the child, the better. One of the good things about most states' statutes of limitations is that children's statutes are typically extended till they're at least of the age of majority or 18 years old. So in Flint, for instance, kids have until their 19th birthday to file a lawsuit if they were injured before they were 18. In New York, it's till the age of 20. And I think in some states, it's 2 years or 3 years past their 18th birthday. The cases themselves, it depends on the venue. Cases in Georgia, Natalie and I handled a lead poisoning case in Georgia before I ever considered doing this type of work routinely. And we were able to resolve the case in 9 or 10 months for a family that had a child that was lead poisoned on an Army base. The cases in the Bronx in New York and in Brooklyn in New York and in Queens in New York, because of the overcrowded courts, some of those cases last 3, 4, 5. I've had some last 6 years, some that I took over when I first got to my firm and ultimately didn't end until the last year or two. Part of that is the court system. Part of it is you really want to file a case and prosecute a case when you're able to prove the damages in a case. And I might be able to file a 3-year-old's lead poisoning case the day they're poisoned, but I may not be able to prove any damages to that child until they're 7 years old. And by filing it at age 3, I'm building in a 4-year period of just plain litigation for no good reason, because it's going to take a minute for me to be able to prove that they're injured. In terms of Flint, it's hard to say how long the typical Flint case lasts because all of the cases they haven't all been consolidated, but they're generally being handled together by the same judge. And so the first cases that are going to go to trial are our 4 bellwether cases. That's 4 out of 3,000. They were selected randomly to the tune of 150, and then it was narrowed down to 100, and then 50, and then 16, and now 4. These are the final 4 cases that will be tried. And so 4 out of my 3,000 cases will be the first tried in the summer of 2021, and all of them were filed in 2016. That's 5 years for the first 4. People wonder sometimes, why do you settle cases? The reality is I could potentially be trying these cases for the next 15 years. And I'm relatively young and I'd be happy to do it, but I guarantee you that the lawyers that I'm litigating against and the judge who's going to hear the cases, they're not all going to be practicing law or serving in the same capacity as a district court judge in 15 years. She may be on the United States Supreme Court. She may be on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. She may decide to retire and go work at, come work with me. She may have been so impressed, like, I can go work with that guy in New York, quit my lifetime appointment and all of my future appointments and go, sling it in New York. So the cases take a really long time. They're hard to prove. And by the nature of the injured parties, they're just built to last a bit.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, I know I'm mindful that a lot of folks have class starting at 1 o'clock. Bo, did you want to chime back in with anything before we sign off here?
No, Corey, I want to thank you for giving of your time. I'm mindful when I hear the notion that you are appearing in federal court, it sounds like tomorrow, that your time is a precious resource, and the fact that you make yourself available just means a lot to me personally, and I know means a lot to all of our attendees, especially our students who are in some ways in the shoes that you were in 17 years ago. So thanks for being here for us.
It's my honor, and literally anytime I could do anything with the university, it's my favorite thing in the world to do. It reminds me of all of the optimism that I had when I was a kid, when I was a law student, and that I really do still have about being a lawyer. My last piece of advice to everybody listening is, especially those of you that are about to become lawyers, do not listen to folks who give you any reason to choose not to become a lawyer. It has been the biggest honor I've ever had in my life. I love my work every single day. I'm proud every day to tell my mom what I do, to tell my kids what I do. And if you treat your profession and you treat being a lawyer with sort of the level of respect and dignity that you want it to have, you'll love your job. And I really recommend that y'all stay on the path.
Thanks, Corey. It's great to see you.
So much,
Thank you all.
Corey. Thanks for doing this.
Yep.